So of course, the guy who did this study didn't believe it, which the point is going to be, the people who did this, obviously we're sort of making fun of them. We're serious people. There's a film crew. It's not a joke. This is not some Saturday Night Live satire. All these people really thought the dog might be psychic. Whatever they did, calling what they did an experiment, they came to the conclusion that the dog was psychic. Much of what happens in this course, especially in research methods, is a very careful refinement of what it means to say there's an experiment. Whatever they did with the film crew, it wasn't something that qualifies as an experiment as the word is going to be used in psychology. The word, just to preview this, in everyday usage, experiment means almost, I'll try something new and see what happens. Well, we'll experiment with, Gatorade, Focus, lime with extra corn syrup to see how it helps my performance or something. But in psychology, an experiment fundamentally means that you're doing careful observations, and we'll do this a lot next week, relying very much on the role of chance to rule out alternative phenomena, where you'll assign, I'm sure you're familiar with this logic, you'll, for example, assign people to experimental conditions by chance to make sure that if one condition differs from another, it's not that the people inherently differed, they preferred to do this or that, but that something in the experiment caused the difference. And the key mechanism, in some sense, one of the great, take it for granted intellectual inventions of the past century or two, is this reliance on the random experiment, on chance. So, it's okay. So we want to know if the dog's really psychic. Why did I make this thing? Well, good. At least it's on film forever on iTunes U. Great. Great idea. Film the class. Okay. So that's the evidence. So this turns out to be, what are some, I'll pause for a second in case you want, if you're already thinking, what are some alternative explanations for this? Like if anybody thinking, oh, of course the dog is sitting by the window because... Yeah, Max? I know everyone's name.
It came off as though the dog went to the window at 5 o'clock every day, so it might just be kind of a time-oriented routine.
Brilliant! Oh, yeah, no, sorry. Yes, that's right. That was actually the first point I put up. The question, in case you're not wearing a microphone, yes, it might be a time-oriented routine. There might be some routine in the home. Sorry to get so excited, but that's exactly right. There might be some routine in the home that occurs at that time, and another routine at the office that occurs at that time, because, of course, the parents know she's coming home and might establish some routine. Nothing can go better than that, so I'll just do it myself for the others. But yes, exactly. Another one is what they would call, in statistics, base rates. It's possible JT goes to the office, can we edit that? Goes to the window every 10 minutes. I mean, what else are you going to do? You go sit on the couch, there's a bone, then you go to the window, you go back to the couch. I mean, I don't have any great intuitions of the life of a dog, but it's just a little apartment in England. There's not that much to do. It might be, in the language of probabilities, that the base rate probability at any given moment of JT being at the window is 0.6. And so, of course, there's a pretty good chance that a bunch of the days he'll be there, because that's where the dog goes, because it looks outside at cats or whatever they look at. Or there may be kind of like cue routines, but there also may be other cues. I mean, they may say things like, oh, Pam may be coming home now. Though dogs do not have language, you're not missing anything. Don't bring the dog to grammar class. They certainly do recognize sound patterns and can distinguish between Pam, the woman's name, and other sound patterns. And it may be that if they commonly say, Pam's leaving now, the dog recognizes that cue. And that's essentially a sign for the dog that says, Pam coming home now, which is not psychic. It's just a... So, what this guy, who unbelievably is named Wiseman, like we rigged it, or maybe he just took that name when getting a professor job, realizes is that you need better evidence than we'll try it and see what happens. So you need what, in classes, I'm not going to dwell on this, they call critical thinking skills, what we just did, thanks to, including to somebody in the first row. Oh, it could be this instead. essentially much of the logic, much of the intellectual work of psychology is continuously not believing it because it could be some other alternative explanation. That's essentially, if anybody decides to go into this, the research field is almost entirely, oh, it can't be, I don't believe any of that, there's some alternative explanation, this is all a bunch of something. So what the Wiseman does is to set up some steps of research. Obviously, the details are not terribly important right now in the sense that there won't be a big essay question, what were the details in Wiseman's experiment on a dog. But the critical features include getting a random number generator that's probably built into a variety of devices you have in front of you right now. There's little algorithms for spitting out essentially random numbers. Giving random numbers to Pam Smart and telling her, please head home at, and the random numbers come out, 2, 4, 5, 245. And so that nobody except Pam Smart knows the random number, and then you see what the dog does then. Taking measures of where this dog spends its time all day long, when Pam heads home, when she's not heading home, when she's sitting in a chair, to establish in the language of this, the base rate probability that the dog stands around by the windows. And of course, throughout all this, making sure the parents don't know when Pam's coming home. So they write this paper that I referenced. It's got 4 experiments. They give JT every chance in the world. There's nothing against dogs. But of course, it doesn't really work at all. And the data do not support none of the 4 studies, the different types. One's the random table thing, et cetera, et cetera. The analysis that JT could detect when the dog is, that the woman is returning home. The discussion section of the paper, if you haven't yet read these, you'll do a little in classes. They have distinct sections with little headers. At the end of the results, you have a discussion section, they call it. We described 4 experiments to test the psychic pet phenomenon. JT failed. Not that JT is a failure himself, of course, but failed to detect when Pam sets off to return home. The point of this is not really number 1, but just in case somebody asks you, just so we know we got the right thing here, no, there was not evidence that pets are psychic. It's not impossible. Then there's actually, I'll mention now before it comes up on screen, there is something in the book called, a section called open-minded skepticism. It's not intelligent for the psychologist to rule out the possibility that pets or somebody else are psychic. Only about 4 years ago, an extremely prominent psychologist at an Ivy League university published a paper that purported to show that in certain conditions, people have psychic powers. I mean, he made it big. He was on the Colbert Show, literally, with its thing. And then like 10 other people tried to replicate the studies. They didn't work. It's reasonable to be open-minded about virtually anything, except then to run it through the mill of the research. The real point of the story is that there are going to be, in this class, a set of methods. They're not going to be that surprising. Like, you could sort of intuit them. Not to go crazy with your question, but in exactly the same way that somebody in the first row intuited one of them. If you think about it, they're almost like the methods of psychology, in part, are exercises in critical logical thinking that rule out hypotheses. Over and over, you'll see that, in essence, the field needs to be scientific, not because your intuitions aren't good, but because there will be circumstances in which you need more than intuitions. The textbook shows you a number of cases where people have conflicting intuitions, like, you know, smart professor-y kind of people, or philosophers, or world statesmen, and you have to resolve those intuitions. Sometimes the intuitions are right and your experiment is not too surprising. Sometimes they're wrong. The similar example is the ESP example. It's on page 13. But all of this is to say that the surprising feature for intro psychology, if you're interested in psychology before the course starts, and let's face it, this is a little more interesting than some things. If the course isn't interesting, I'm really blowing it. Obviously, we have the luxury of an interesting subject matter. But if you're interested in it, the surprising thing at first is that the book is full of graphs and charts and numbers through which an experiment is analyzed. The field has evolved that way just like all the other sciences. The field has evolved that way because of those many times where people's intuitions conflict, intuitions go wrong. The surprising feature about introductory psychology is that you do find yourself dipping a lot, not into an interesting analysis of a fascinating individual, but to somebody's experiment with 10 experimental conditions and some device to measure something and a bunch of other apparatus and some statistical analyses. And all that's there and will be throughout the semester because perfectly smart people like the Viennese film crew and Rupert Sheldrake can get it wrong, and the only way to find out is to figure out ways of addressing psychology questions with the same scientific objectivity that you take for granted in every other class in the sciences. Sometimes it's harder in psychology, just for those of you majoring in the other sciences, because you have the extra issue that in the psychology, the subject matter that you're studying is thinking about the subject matter too. And so it's hard often to run studies because the studies are about people. The people are as smart as you. They're thinking about the fact that they're in a study. And that kind of thing creates a lot of the challenges that you'll see addressed throughout the course, especially in our coverage of research methods.